The chandeliers glittered above the great hall, their light cascading like rivers of silver across the polished marble floor. The guests moved like currents in that glow draped in silks, diamonds, and the quiet arrogance of wealth. Waiters glided through the crowd with trays of golden champagne, their white gloves spotless, their smiles rehearsed. Laughter rang out, mingled with the low hum of deals, alliances, and whispered betrayals. It was more than a party, it was a gathering of power, a theater where the city's wealthiest paraded their success. Here, reputations were forged, egos were inflated, and masks of civility hid ambition sharper than knives. But beneath the glamour, beneath the orchestra's music and the perfume-laden air, something unexpected stirred, something no one in that room could have foreseen. At the center of it all stood a man who had built his world on dominance, a man who thrived on control, Victor Langford, a self-proclaimed titan, whose empire stretched across industries like iron chains. His voice was the kind that silenced rooms, his glare enough to bend men double. To Victor, respect was not earned, it was demanded, and he wore arrogance as easily as others wore tuxedos. Invisible among the swirl of gowns and tuxedos was someone Victor had never noticed, and never intended to. A young woman in a crisp burgundy uniform, her yellow gloves clutched tightly round the handle of a broom. Her name was Marisol Vega. To the world of chandeliers and champagne, she was no one. But tonight, her quiet courage would rise higher than all the chandeliers combined. Marisol had come into Victor's service not by dream, but by necessity. Life had been merciless. Left widowed while still young, with a child barely beginning school, she had carried burdens heavier than stone. Her days were long to jobs, endless fatigue, and a constant fight to keep her daughter's smile alive. She had scrubbed floors until her fingers cracked. Also, her little girl could hold on to the hope of a brighter tomorrow. Yet what weighed on her heart most was not poverty, but the way the world treated her, as though her existence was nothing more than the echo of a mop across tiles. That night, the evening's polished illusion fractured over something small. A guest, tipsy with laughter, let his glass slip. Crystal shattered against the marble in a sharp, delicate explosion. Instantly, Marisol stepped forward. She crouched gracefully, broom in hand, intent on sweeping the shards before someone was hurt. Her motions were swift, efficient, invisible until Victor's voice thundered across the hall. "Who dares interrupt me?" he bellowed. As though the glass had fallen solely despite him, he was mid-speech, basking in the attention of the elite, when the sound had broken his rhythm. His face flushed crimson, his fingers stabbing the air. "No one silences me." Music faltered. Conversation died, and all eyes turned to the woman kneeling with her broom. Guests leaned forward, delighted by the promise of humiliation. Waiters stiffened, terrified. The staff exchanged frozen glances. Everyone expected Marisol to bow, to beg forgiveness, to crumble beneath Victor's rage. But she did none of these things. Slowly, she rose, one hand still wrapped around her broom. She looked Victor in the eyes with a steadiness that startled even him. And then, in a gesture as simple as it was powerful, she lifted her finger to her lips. A command without words, a whisper turned into thunder. "Enough." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. A maid, nothing but a maid, had silenced the emperor. The room died. Victor froze, his mouth half open. What shocked him was not just her audacity, but the unshaken depth in her gaze. It was not defiance for amusement. It was not mockery. It was truth, distilled into eyes that had endured far greater storms than public shame. Her gaze carried grief, dignity, and a courage born from hardship. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. He expected her to shrink. He expected tears, excuses. Instead, Marisol spoke. Her voice was steady, calm, yet unyielding. She told him that real strength was not measured in how loudly one shouted, but in how deeply one listened. She reminded him that respect was not something reserved for the wealthy, but a dignity owed to every human being. She told him the floor she polished that night would gleam long after his boastful words were forgotten, and that the hands of the unseen carried the weight of empires. Her words pierced the glittering arrogance around him like a blade through glass. The room was silent. Guests who had chuckled now stared at the ground in shame. Waiters who had held their breath felt their hearts pound with pride. For the first time in years, Victor Langford stood wordless, his empire, his wealth, his reputation all meaningless. Against the truth spoken by a woman the world called invisible, Marisol bent again, gathered the last shards of crystal, and walked away without another word. She left behind silence heavier than any speech, and a man stripped bare of his illusions. But the story did not end in that hall. Whispers of the moment spread like wildfire how a maid had silenced the millionaire. Some riddled it with awe, others with mockery. Yet for Victor, the moment was not gossip, it was a mirror. Later that night, alone in his vast study, he could not shake her words. He thought of his own childhood, of a small home where hunger was familiar and dignity was a fragile shield. He had clawed his way up, but in doing so, he had buried compassion beneath layers of greed and pride. Marisol's words unearthed what he thought was long dead. Days later, he called her not to dismiss her, but to listen, truly listen. He asked about her life, her daughter, her struggles. For the first time in years, he allowed silence to exist between his questions, not filling it with his ego, but with attention. And as Marisol spoke, he realized something life-altering. The wealthiest thing in that room was not his fortune, but her resilience. From then on, changes rippled through his household and beyond. Wages rose, working conditions improved, scholarships appeared for the children of his employees. And Victor, who once prided himself on his roar, began to find pride in listening. His empire slowly transformed from a monument to his ego into a foundation where dignity was as valued as profit. Marisol's daughter grew up watching her mother's quiet strength alter the life of a man who thought himself untouchable. And she dreamed bigger, not of wealth or power, but of courage, the kind that could turn stone hearts human again. Victor Langford, the man who once thundered, "No one silences me," came to understand a truth greater than power. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in silencing others, but in being silenced by truth and changed forever by it. So, dear listener, what would you have done in Marisol's place? Would you have stood tall, broom in hand, against the storm of arrogance, or would fear have kept you silent? Because, in the end, it is not the roar of the powerful that shapes the world, but the steady voices of ordinary people who dare to speak truth.